Let me paint you a picture. You're standing in a shop. It's nothing special, maybe a grocery store, maybe a petrol station. You've got something small in your hand, and without even thinking about it, you're doing the math, quietly in your head. Not because you're stingy, not because you don't know how to manage money, but because the number sitting in your bank account right now has a very firm opinion about what you can and cannot do today. Now, think about someone else. Same age as you. They booked a flight last Tuesday, mid-afternoon, on a whim because they saw cheap tickets and felt like a change of scenery. They didn't open a spreadsheet, they didn't check their balance 3 times, they just went. Here's what I want you to sit with for a moment. Those two people aren't living different versions of the same life. They're living completely different lives. And the gap between them? It's not luck. It's not even a massive difference in salary. It's a specific, measurable threshold, one that researchers have actually studied and given a name to. I'm James, and today we're going to find that line and walk through exactly what your money is doing at every stage of income before you get there. Here's the thing. Most people have a surprisingly distorted view of where they sit on the income scale, and that misreading costs them more than they realize. The median household income in the U.S. right now is around $83,000. Not one person, everyone under that roof combined. The average individual full-time worker earns closer to $62,000. So when a couple says, "We're doing fine, we pull in 6 figures together," they're describing a household income that is, quite literally, average. Not poor, not wealthy, right in the middle. Pew Research puts about 30% of Americans in the low-income category, under $56,000 combined. The middle class sits between $75,000 and $125,000, and only around 10% of households ever reach $250,000. Now, here's a number that sounds reassuring until you dig into it. 42% of American households earn over $100,000. Sounds like a lot of comfortable people, right? But $100,000 in Manhattan, adjusted for the actual cost of living, has the purchasing power of roughly $30,000 somewhere more affordable. Same paycheck, completely different reality. So the real question today isn't what does your salary look like on paper? It's this: at what point does money start working for you instead of you working entirely for it? Let's find out. And we're going to follow one person the whole way through. Meet James. He's 27, works in logistics for a mid-sized company. He's not careless with money. He actually thinks about it more than most people. He earns $38,000 a year, which after taxes lands him around $2,375 a month in take-home pay. That's everything he has to work with. Now let's see where it goes. Rent on a basic one-bedroom, $1,100, and he hasn't bought a single thing to eat yet. Utilities, $175. Car payment on a used vehicle, because where James lives, public transit isn't really an option, $350. Insurance and fuel, $300. Groceries, kept tight, $370. Phone and internet, you genuinely can't function professionally without them, $120. Health insurance from his paycheck, $130. Student loan repayment, $300. Total going out every month, $2,845. Total coming in, $2,375. James is $470 short, before he's dealt with a single unexpected cost, before a copay, a parking ticket, a friend's wedding, or a car making a noise it shouldn't. And I want to be really clear about something here. This isn't a budgeting problem. This isn't James being irresponsible. This is arithmetic.
The numbers simply don't cooperate, no matter how disciplined you are. What does living like this actually feel like? It feels like keeping a quiet, invisible running total in your head every time you shop. It feels like telling your friends you're not hungry when they suggest a restaurant, because that's easier than explaining that you genuinely cannot afford to be there. It feels like wondering if your car can hold out one more week without a service, because that $80 isn't small when you're already in the red. And here's something the financial advice world rarely says out loud. The less money you have, the more expensive everything gets. Overdraft fees hit the people who can't keep a buffer. High-interest loans target the people who can't wait. The system doesn't just ignore people at this income level, it actively profits from them. 5 years pass. James works hard, gets noticed, earns a real promotion. He's now at $65,000 a year, around $4,250 take-home per month. For the first time, the budget technically balances. He takes a breath. Slightly better apartment, $1,350. More reliable car, $400. Insurance and fuel, $330. Decent groceries, $430. Student loans, unbothered by his raise, $400. Health, phone, internet, $260. And now, something he hasn't had before, a small line item for actually living. A gym, the occasional dinner out, one streaming service, $250. Monthly surplus, about $630. He's smart about it, puts $325 toward retirement to get the employer match. That leaves $305 a month for savings. At that rate, building a 3-month emergency fund takes well over a year, assuming nothing goes sideways in the meantime. Something always goes sideways. The car needs work, an unexpected bill arrives. One bad month and he's back to zero, starting the clock again. This is what people mean when they say they're doing okay, but underneath that, there's a quiet anxiety that never fully goes away. You're no longer drowning, but you're not swimming either. You're treading water, and everyone around you is calling it progress. More years pass. James changes companies, negotiates properly this time, and lands at $100,000 a year. 6 figures, the number people spend years chasing. Take home around $6,150 a month. Rent or mortgage in a mid-cost city, $1,800. Utilities, $225. Car, $500. Insurance and fuel, $350. Good groceries, $465. Loans, health, phone, $730. And a real life, plans on the weekend, the occasional trip, experiences that make life feel like life, $500. Total out, $4,570. Left over, $1,580 a month. After retirement contributions, James has around $750 to spare. He can build a proper emergency fund within a year. A financial shock doesn't automatically spiral into a crisis anymore. But here's what I think is the most underrated thing that $100,000 actually buys. And it's not the apartment or the car or the savings rate. It's the fact that James wakes up in the morning and doesn't immediately think about money. That might sound like a small thing. It really isn't. The absence of that constant low-level financial dread is genuinely one of the most valuable things income can provide, and most people never get to experience it. That said, James is not rich, not by a long stretch. So if he lives in a major city, that $1,800 rent is probably $2,800. The math gets uncomfortable again fast. $100,000 makes you a strong swimmer, but you're still swimming against a current. The water just isn't quite as deep. A few more years, a senior role, $150,000 a year. Take home around $8,800 a month. Mortgage on a proper home, $2,200. Comfortable car, $600. Full grocery shop, $500. Real holidays, dinners, experiences, $1,000. Everything else, $1,400. Total, $5,710. Left over, $3,120 a month. For the first time, James can max his retirement contributions, invest on top of that, and still have money left. He can say yes to things, and more importantly, the question he asks himself starts to shift. It's no longer, can I afford this? It becomes, do I actually want this? So that sounds subtle. It isn't. That shift is the whole game.
Bureau of Labor Statistics data backs this up. For the bottom 60% of earners, personal savings are functionally negative when you factor in debt. Real, consistent wealth-building savings don't start in earnest until household income hits $100,000 to $150,000. Below that line, every dollar Amir earns gets eaten the moment it arrives. Above it, some dollars finally survive long enough to multiply. That's compounding. And you can't access compounding without margin. You don't have margin until your fixed costs stop consuming everything. That line sits at around $150,000, not $75,000, not six figures. $150,000 is the point where you stop trading time for survival and start building something that lasts. A 35-year-old who maxes their retirement account and puts an extra $1,000 a month into a basic index fund is looking at roughly $2.2 million by 65. Not because they're brilliant, not because they got lucky, because they had enough margin to let time do the heavy lifting. Now here's where the story gets genuinely surprising. Goldman Sachs surveyed Americans on paycheck-to-paycheck living at every income level. Among households earning $200,000 to $300,000, only 16% live paycheck to paycheck. That's the most financially stable bracket in the country. Then income rises to $300,000 to $500,000. The paycheck-to-paycheck rate jumps to 41%. Above $500,000, 40%. Essentially the same as households earning under $50,000. People earning $500,000 a year and people earning $45,000 a year live paycheck to paycheck at nearly identical rates. This is not an income story. It's a lifestyle inflation story. The quiet, invisible force that expands to fill every dollar you earn, regardless of how many dollars that is. At $45,000, you spend everything because you have to. At $500,000, you spend everything because a $4,000 monthly car payment, a $9,000 mortgage, and $40,000 a year in school fees have quietly become what people at your level do. It no longer feels like excess. It feels like the baseline. The $200,000 to $300,000 sweet spot works precisely because it's the window where income has briefly outrun the lifestyle arms race, where there's margin before the spending has had a chance to catch up. A Federal Reserve study found that when someone in a neighborhood wins a significant sum of money, the bankruptcy rates of their neighbors go up. Visible wealth triggers visible spending. More money doesn't automatically create more security. It just raises the floor of what feels normal. And that floor rises faster than almost anyone anticipates. Here's the question most people never think to ask when they're chasing an income goal. What level actually makes me happy? Two researchers, Killingsworth and Kahneman, spent years famously disagreeing on this. In 2023, they combined their data and published together. What they found was interesting. For about 80% of people, happiness continues rising with income at every level. No ceiling. More money, more well-being, all the way up. But for the unhappiest 20%, people dealing with serious depression, grief, chronic illness, struggling relationships,
happiness stops rising at around $100,000 to $110,000. Beyond that, more money doesn't reach what's actually hurting. You cannot lifestyle your way out of a mental health crisis. The problems that remain at $500,000 are not the kind a bigger paycheck solves. And separately, Stanford researchers tracking over 1 billion tax records found that the wealthiest 1% of men live 14.6 years longer than the poorest 1%. At age 40, a wealthy man can statistically expect to reach 87, a poor man 72. That's not a quality of life difference, that's a completely different quantity of life. Financial stress is a public health issue. We've just normalized it so thoroughly it barely gets discussed as one. The real threshold, based on actual savings data, not gut feeling, sits somewhere between $100,000 and $150,000 in household income, depending on where you live. Below it, the system runs you. Your fixed costs consume everything, and you are perpetually one piece of bad luck away from starting over. Above it, you start running the system. The margin builds, the compounding does its work. Something that actually resembles wealth begins to take shape. But the Goldman Sachs data delivers the most important truth in this entire conversation. The threshold is a doorway, not a destination. Walking through it doesn't make you financially secure on its own. What makes you secure is keeping your fixed costs consistently below your income and letting the difference accumulate quietly and automatically for decades. The salary isn't the variable that matters most. The gap between income and fixed costs is. And while that gap is genuinely impossible to create at the lowest income levels, where the math flatly refuses to cooperate, above a certain point, it becomes a choice. Below a certain income, the system is stacked against you. Above it, the only thing stacking it are your own decisions. Open your bank account, right now, not later today, not tomorrow. Add up every fixed cost, rent, car, insurance, subscriptions, loans, everything that leaves your account automatically whether you wanted to or not. Then look at your take-home pay. The gap between those two numbers is the only financial figure that really matters. The salary, the job title, the apartment, those are scenery. The gap is the story. If that number made you uncomfortable, that's actually a good sign. Discomfort is usually where honest decisions begin. If it surprised you in the right direction, you're already further ahead than you probably think. The people who build real wealth aren't always the highest earners in the room. They're the ones who figured out early that financial security isn't a salary, it's a structure. And a structure can be built at almost any income level where the arithmetic doesn't outright refuse to cooperate. Amir started by doing mental math on whether he could afford something small. The question for you is, what are you starting with, and what are you building from here? If this gave you a new way of looking at your money, subscribe. There's a lot more where this came from.